We're very grateful to have Dr. Arthur Evans and his associate, Dr. Akbar. And thank you, Kefui, for putting a lot of this in place. I'm not even sure if our section would have existed had it not been for your determination and your motivation.
So happy Black History Month, everyone. I am grateful for your time with us today. I begin with a quote from Janaya Khan, co-founder of Black Lives Matter. Privilege is not about what you've gone through. It is about what you haven't had to go through. And right now we are in a time that is calling on us to learn the stories that we don't know. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa, Canada. So I'm in the capital city. I think I'm safe. I thank my Indigenous brothers and sisters for allowing my family and I to be settlers in this land. The Black Psychology section was founded after the murder of George Floyd. The members wanted to focus on matters that impact Black people and how best psychology can address these issues. We want to encourage everyone who is present here to join the section if you are not already a member. We want to just say thank you so much for being part of this process today, this event, this discussion. We would like to encourage everyone to fully participate in this event. We welcome all voices, and I'm very proud to be Canadian with all of you today. So I hope you enjoy this event. Thank you.
This is Barbara Afram. She has a spoken word that she will share.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Barbara Afram. I am co-student rep of the Black Psychology section, and I'm so glad to be here this morning. I have a poem that I will be reciting, and it is by Gwendolyn Brooks. It's titled Speech to the Young, Speech to the Progress Toward. Say to them, say to the downkeepers, the sun slappers, the self-soilers, the harmony hushers, even if you are not ready for day, it cannot always be night. You will be right, for that is the hard home run. Live not for battles won. Live not for the end of the song. Live in the along. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Manuel Reimer. He's with the Black, Indigenous, and Racialized People Psychology Web. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Kefui asked me to share a little bit about the group, but I wanted to quickly say I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people here in Kitchener. So our group is kind of a supplement to the Black Psychology group. A little bit more unconstrained in a way. Our mission is to be an accessible networking, to be able to do unconstrained advocacy for Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in psychology and somewhat beyond. To do learning and reflection, sharing experiences and thoughts, and supporting processes that people are involved in. So people can bring ideas that they're working on already or events that they're organizing, and we try to support that as good as we can. And we try to be relatively open and flexible in the way that we're structuring ourselves. We try to have a equitable approach to our work and some level of informality. And it's all about privileging Black, Indigenous, and racialized voices, which might look strange that I'm here talking, but that was Kefui asking me to do so. There's some of us white folks who are supporting this work. And we meet about monthly, and our general objectives are to ensure that professional, educational, and scholarly psychology meet the needs of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, to support adequate representation of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in key decision-making committees and leadership roles, and support adequate representation among academics and professionals. And I will kind of leave it there. If you're interested to join us, I will put my email address in the chat. You can just contact me and I will just add you to our list and our monthly meetings. Yeah, so thanks for letting me share this. And I wanted to also quickly say, we are planning a panel discussion on related issues to what we're also talking about today. And we will let you know in due notice when that is scheduled, and we do the advertisement for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. So next, I'm super happy to introduce Dr. Karen Cohen. She's our CEO of the Canadian Psychological Association. And we're lucky to have her here today because she's stepping away to do other things on April 28th. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. And thanks, Kefwi, for acknowledging the land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation on which we live in Ottawa, where CPA's offices are located. It really is my great pleasure to have been invited today to say a few words in recognition of the terrific series of events that the Black Psychology section has hosted during Black History and Psychology Month in Canada. When I read the title of the series, Are We There Yet? I had two immediate thoughts. One was, we are a long way from good enough. And the other was, where is there? Since 2019, when the CPA launched a working group to respond to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Report, the CPA and its members started a long overdue journey, a journey that would have CPA as an organization, the profession and discipline of psychology, and its members and affiliates ask themselves some really difficult questions. What have we done and not done when it comes to racialized, marginalized, and equity-seeking groups, and how are we going to do better? We have a ways to go, but I can say we've started that journey. The CPA's 2020 strategic plan includes 2 new goals: to carry out the recommendation of our response to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Report, and to promote and model equity, diversity, and inclusion in all we do. We have formed a standing knowledge sharing group, a standing committee on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And with the leadership of founders like Kefwi, Helen, and Aaron, we have launched a Black Psychology section. We've inaugurated a bursary program for Indigenous students, supported the charitable activities of equity-seeking groups in Canada and internationally, hosted webinars and workshops aimed to increase the cultural literacy of CPA members, students, and affiliates, and released policy positions that have shaped legislation in Canada, particularly as it relates to LGBTQ+ persons. It's not enough. It's not nearly enough, but it's a start. It's a start to a journey that we must better define, a journey that's likely to evolve as we go, and a journey that is as important as its destination. It's my hope that all of us will be part of that journey. For a discipline and a profession that is about understanding and optimizing how people think, feel, and behave, at our best, we have much to contribute to creating kinder and more inclusive communities and societies. As the CPA's first female CEO, a psychologist, a widow, a Jewish person, a mother, a colleague, an ally, an advocate, a mentor, and a friend, I have known privilege and prejudice, both sometimes overt and sometimes subtle. As someone whose career has been in the service of the discipline and profession, I have great conviction that we can bring about needed change in individuals, communities, societies, and in ourselves. In so doing, I invite all of you to think about the many identities you have, and especially the identities we share as members of the profession and discipline, as people living on Turtle Island, as professionals committed to the health and welfare of the people and communities we serve. It is the identities we celebrate, the voices we elevate, the consensus we create from what we have in common that will help us on our journey to be better and do better. With no further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Arthur Evans. Dr. Evans is the CEO of the American Psychological Association. He holds a doctorate in clinical and community psychology from the University of Maryland. Before joining the CPA, he served as commissioner of Philadelphia's Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. His accomplishments there served as a national and international model for health system change. Dr. Evans' work as an advocate has been recognized in several awards, including ones from the National Council of Behavioral Health, the American Medical Association, 3 named for the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and the White House Office of National Drug Control. He has been described as an unconventional leader and innovator for health system change who engages and empowers voices and stakeholders from the grassroots and from communities. A health systems innovator, an advocate for social justice, and a psychologist, I'm sure Dr. Evans' words today will serve as a model and an inspiration. Please welcome Dr. Arthur Evans.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. I really appreciate that, and appreciate the invitation from Ms. Sawyer, who I've had many conversations with, and I'm just delighted to be here.
Monica, you're up next.
Yes, hello.
Thank you.
So wonderful to see you, Dr. Evans. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mesa Akbar, who is a scientist practitioner and APA's Chief Diversity Officer, charged with infusing equity, diversity, and inclusion into the association's work. As the leading architect of APA's evolving EDI framework, Dr. Akbar works with APA staff, leaders, and members to refine and build consensus for an overall plan, operationalize its goals, and establish metrics to monitor and ensure progress. The CDO also serves as a spokesperson and advocate for EDI in the field of psychology, both within and outside the association. Before assuming the CDO post, she was the founder and chief executive officer of a clinical practice based in New Haven, Connecticut, that specialized in race-based trauma. She also created a consulting firm and educational network focused on organizational cultural transformation. Her firm delivered cutting-edge programs anchored in EDI to city governments, public schools, and court systems, amongst other entities. Dr. Akbar's areas of specialty include racial identity development, racism, urban trauma, and allyship. And she has written research articles, books, and book chapters extensively on these topics. Dr. Akbar is an experienced instructor and trainer in EDI for both the medical and the broader community. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Monica, for that wonderful introduction. And I remember you during our time in New Haven, Connecticut. So it's a pleasure to see you again in this forum. First, I want to just open the conversation by thanking the Canadian Psychological Association for inviting us into this space. It's not something that we take for granted. It's something that we honor each and every time. I want to make sure that we honor the ancestral lands that we are sitting in, Dr. Evans and I, which are the Anacostans and the Piscataway peoples. And you see a detailed description of that in the chat. And, you know, as we are going to enter into this conversation with you, which we want to make a conversation, this is building community. And I love the fact that we're building community between our two associations. I want to make sure that we stand in the spirit of why we're here, which is thinking about our ancestral heritage. And we all have a story. We all have a story to share. And that story reflects itself in the work that we do as psychologists and in the field of psychology. And as we stand here in community with you during this Black History Month event, I want to start by asking Dr. Evans a really important question, which is, Dr. Evans, what led you to become a psychologist? I need you to tell us first about the experiences that shaped your life that led us to have this moment with you, with this audience.
Very good question. You know, a little bit of background. My dad was in the United States military, United States Air Force. My mother was a school teacher. I was born in the, late 1959, and early 1960s, which is relevant to what I'm about to say, because at that point in the United States, we were still experiencing a lot of segregation, a lot of discrimination, And even though my father was in the military, I was born on a military base, lived first few years of my life in Japan, came back to the United States. The United States was still segregated. And so I lived in this duality of, on the one hand, being in an integrated military environment, and on the other hand, living, once we came back to the United States, my father didn't want to keep moving us around the world and all the places he was going to be stationed. So he moved us into the community that was next to the Air Force Base in Florida, where we were stationed when we came back to the U.S. And he moved us there, and that was segregated community. And so I saw both worlds. And I think early on in my life, I really became committed to this idea that my life would be dedicated to trying to eliminate those disparities and inequities that I saw and saw every day. In fact, the first 3 years of my education, I was in schools that were segregated. And the only reason that I went to an integrated school in the 4th grade was because my mother was a school teacher and she taught in that school. So that was my early experience, and that really sat with me and shaped how I think about and see the world. And the thing that I wanted to do when I finished high school was to be a clinician, because that's the only thing that I knew. I kind of knew I wanted to work with people and help people. The only thing that I knew was, I saw Bob Newhart. He was the only psychologist on TV back in, so I'm really dating myself. He was the only psychologist you saw on television. And I wanted to do that, to help people that way. And, but when I went to my undergraduate program, what I found out that psychology was not just about mental health and helping people through counseling or through psychotherapy, but it was this broad discipline of people who were trying to understand human behavior in all kinds of contexts, from the social to the neuropsychological to children's development to, anything that deals with people is something that our field is related to. And so my notions of how to help people really expanded from just looking at psychotherapy and mental health services to using the science of human behavior to help people and to advance society. So that's kind of how I became a psychologist, and that thinking has really influenced how I then think about not only my job in terms of the work that I do, primarily as CEO or when I was mental health commissioner, but very specifically how I think about issues related to helping advance racial and social justice and equity. The slide that you're seeing is basically just making the point that I was making a little while ago, which is name one issue that we're dealing with as a society that involves people for which psychology isn't relevant. And you really can't. Psychology is needed now more than ever. And I think we as psychologists have this great opportunity to think about how we use what we know from our science, from our training, to apply that. One last thing, Martin Luther King said early on when he was doing his work, he said that of all the forms of discrimination and inequalities, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. And what that says to me is that while I see a lot of places and ways that we can, and areas where we need to improve, what I believe I was called to do as a psychologist is to work through health as a way of addressing those inequalities. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with you today some of the ways that I have used my training and my background to actually do this. So let me turn it back to you, Maisa. We're going to do, we're going to do a little back and forth here. So you'll hear a little bit of me, a little bit from Maisa. And We both want to be personal, and we want to bring our training to this talk today. So, Maisa, I'm going to ask you the same question. How did you become a psychologist, and how has that then influenced how you approach the work that you've done?
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Wow. My journey was certainly not linear. I am the only child of immigrant parents. My parents hailed from the Caribbean island of the Dominican Republic. And they came to this country like many, immigrants that are coming to different countries to try to find a better life for their family. And it was an interesting time when, there are so many cultural differences. They didn't speak the language in the United States, but they were certainly trying to navigate and do the best that they could. And, I would say that my story is not much different than a lot of immigrant stories that maybe you might hear. It might look different, it might feel different, but certainly the challenges that came along with integrating and trying to acculturate to American culture was really complicated and complex. And there was a time in their journey here where they felt that that they couldn't survive anymore under the conditions that they were experiencing. And so when I was a young teenager, they decided to go back to our island nation. And they forgot one really important thing was to take me with them. And so, that was really complicated. They left me with family and trusted me to be taken care of by family. And it really challenged my conceptualization of community and what family has become, which is not always the family that you're born to, but the family that you inherit over time, right? And that began sort of my journey. I mean, I struggled quite a bit as a young person to find my footing. There were moments where I think in today's definition, I probably would be considered homeless. And there were many traumas that came along the way. And that really anchored in me a passion and a desire to be able to help other children and other people in communities that were like mine to navigate the complexities of their lives and the complexities of the environments that they live in, and to try to find some level of calmness, of peace, of ways to feel healed and whole. And that began my journey of wanting to become a psychologist. So it was certainly not an easy path. It certainly wasn't a lived experience that I thought at that time would shape the way that I would see the world. And certainly if you were to ask little Maisa today, if she ever thought she would be the chief diversity officer of the American Psychological Association, she would say, "Are you kidding? Why?" So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to for us to both share the importance of that lived experience and how it has shaped not only our journey, Dr. Evans, but how it has allowed for this opportunity for us to team together to do this work, which I believe is by no coincidence. So I have to ask you this question. We are in a world right now where we talk a lot about lived experiences. In 2020, when the world turned upside down for us, it was no longer a luxury to include that in the conversation. It was a necessity. It became a necessity. And I think that we can't lead into this conversation without understanding how your background and your experiences influence the approach to your work. I'd love for you to share that with the audience here. How has that experience shaped you?
Yeah, would show up a couple of the slides here. I was intentional about mentioning the duality of my early experience of living both in a integrated and a segregated community, being parts of the integrated and segregated communities at the same time. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate is that in life, most things require multiple ways and multiple perspectives in order to for us to be effective. And so what my upbringing the way that has shaped me is to embrace all of what we do as psychologists. And one of the things that I have found most important in that is to both appreciate what's come before us, but also being able to critique what has come before us in order to make progress. And so what I want to do is spend a little time talking about how I have come to rethink how we help people from a mental health standpoint. What you see before you is what I believe is the mental model that we have for how we help people who have mental health problems. I call it a black box strategy, where we create a black box called treatment. Could be a treatment program, a residential program, an inpatient psychiatric hospital. People get sick. That's the little person that you see out there to the left. They come to us. We diagnose them. We figure out what's wrong with them. We treat what's wrong with them and from our assessment, and then we discharge them as though they have been healed, and that's the way we derive outcomes. Now, as a psychologist and as someone who's done direct services, overseen services, paid for services as a public payer, I know that this system has worked for a lot of people. But as a mental model for how we think about how we help people, there are some limitations that have really hurt us and held us back. And if we were in a live audience, what I would do at this point is I would ask you, audience, what are some of the problems with this as the way that we think about how we help people who have mental health and substance use problems? You would say things like, well, first of all, when people have these problems, they don't often recognize them, so they don't know where to go for help. You would recognize that even if they recognize that they have a problem, that they don't go. Half the people who have mental health problems in the U.S. Ever come to treatment, and that's a far smaller number for communities of color. You would say that treatment should not be a box where we treat everyone pretty much the same way. If you go to a residential program, for example, everyone gets up at the same time, they eat at the same time, they go to the same groups, when the individual differences are quite significant. You would point out that when people leave, that they are not, quote, fixed. And we've sold people this idea that, you come to treatment, and if you come to treatment, we can fix you, when the reality is that this is an acute care paradigm for what we know are chronic conditions. We know that if you have a mental health or substance use condition, that it's more like treating diabetes than it is treating a broken leg. You would point out that for many people, this paradigm does not work because people don't know how to get to those services, or those services aren't available. So those are just a few of the critiques, and we could go on. There are many other critiques of this, but I think that the major problem is that it constrains how we think. Because if this is the model, then the only way that we can help people is to build more treatment programs. The only way that we can help people is for people to come to us and for us to figure out what's wrong with them. So what I want to do is offer a different way of thinking that if you go to the next slide, that helps us to think about other ways that we can help people. And I want to do that first by starting to make the case that not only are all the things that I talked about problematic, but I want to talk about some of the other things that we know. This is a depiction of what the proportion of the population who will have a mental health diagnosis looks like. About 25% of the population, actually it's 26% of the population, will have a diagnosable mental health condition, 75% won't. About 5% of the population will have the most serious forms. And so the way our healthcare system works in the US and most places in the world is that if you have a diagnosis, you can get help. If you're in the 75% of people who don't have a diagnosis, there's nothing that we can do. It's very hard for you to get any help. The problem with that paradigm is that many of the people in the 75% will migrate up to the 25% at some point in their lives, and that many of the people in the 75% have subclinical issues or issues that could benefit from interventions from our field, but because our healthcare system doesn't work that way, we essentially ignore them. If you go to the next slide, the other problem that we have is that if you looked at what are the factors that influence whether or not influence our health status, it turns out that health care is only about counts for only about 10% of the variance in our health status. There are other factors have a much greater effect on our health status than health care. But in the US, we will spend this year close to $4 trillion with a T dollars on health care, often ignoring other areas that have a greater impact. If you go to the next slide, many of these are what we call social determinants of health. We know that education, income, employment, housing, these things have a much greater impact on our mental health and health status often than what we can do for people in our treatment programs. But as a field, we don't pay a lot of attention to these because we're so focused on managing and treating symptoms. So the idea of a population health perspective is this, that we would redo that pyramid that I showed earlier. And if we roughly divided the population up into 3 different categories, the people who have a diagnosis, people who have subclinical issues or who are at greater risk, and then the healthy people, this is what our goals would look like. At the top part of the pyramid, we would be focused on effective and efficient clinical care. In the middle part of the pyramid, what we would want to do is to reduce risk or intervene at the earliest possible moment. And then at the bottom part of the pyramid, we would be focused on keeping people healthy. So this is a reframing of how we think about how we help people. And it has the benefit of addressing many of the critiques that I talked about earlier. One is that we're working upstream because we're trying to keep people healthy. We are working earlier if people are at risk or have subclinical issues. We're working at a different level of analysis, not just the individual level, but we're working at a much more of a group or a population level. And so this is what we mean by a whole population approach, not just focusing on the top part of the pyramid, but really focusing on the entire the entire population. And that's the way we get the health outcomes that we want for everyone, but particularly for communities of color. Reframing is really important. So I want to ask you a question. So I remember when I first talked to you in the interview process and we were hiring our first chief diversity officer. One of the things I talked to you about was my belief that this work was about structural and systems change. So I just described how I have rethought how we should reshape systems. And a lot of the work that I've done over the last decade before coming into APA was about reshaping the systems and structures so that we could really work in that whole population kind of framework. What I said to you, and I remember saying this and then thinking, how is MISA thinking about this? I said, you know, people are wanting me to work in a certain way. They want me to do projects, right? So, you know, fund a project to do X, something that is visible. And if we are going to change systems and structures, a lot of that work doesn't have the same kind of visibility. It's harder. It takes longer. It's more difficult and challenging. But I was just wondering, you know, what was your reaction to this idea that what we should be doing as an association should be about structures and systems, especially given how we know many people look at how we do this kind of work?
Boy, if I were to say in this audience that I thought it would be an easy task, you know, I'd be caught in a dead lie. I remember probably looking at you with like deer in the headlights, because I knew that the task before me was going to be nothing short of extremely complex, and and it was going to be a challenge that we were ready for. But I understood really quickly that the approach that we needed to take had to be a systemic approach, and that it wasn't going to be just an approach that was focused on the work that we were doing within the association, but that it needed to translate to everything that carried over into the discipline of psychology, and how psychology, as the field that is uniquely positioned to be the experts in human behavior, were going to address critical societal issues that continue to come over and over again. I mean, no sooner did we get over, an incredible existential trauma, another one came, and another one came, and another one came, and we couldn't even catch our breath. But at the same time, we understood what was in front of us. And so, it was early on in 2018 when you commissioned that, if you can go to the next slide, when you commissioned that it was time for us as a discipline to have a framework for us to work on that was uniformed and when we were all on the same page. So within months of me taking on the position, we completed the equity, diversity, and inclusion framework. This allowed us to have a way of doing EDI. And we anchor, by the way, equity first, because we understand that without equity, we cannot celebrate diversity, increase diversity, and we cannot at all understand what inclusion is going to look like. We needed to create the baseline of equity in order for us to be able to do our work. But it really did shape the way that we started to think about this work. We knew that we had to take several foundational steps. And the steps began with considering what has been our role, if any, in understanding how maybe we have contributed to harms in psychology and with communities of color. How can we engage in the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion if we don't take personal responsibility as a discipline for perhaps the harms that we have done? And the harms could have been time relevant, but nonetheless harms that were created and that continue to exist. We needed also to define the problem. What is the problem that we are looking to target, and what is the purpose that we're choosing and looking to achieve? How do we do this from an approach of systemic change? How do we influence policy? And how do we engage in these foundational steps in a way that is responsible? The other thing that we needed to acknowledge are the multiple missteps. Moving this work forward without that acknowledgement really just continues to perpetuate harm. It's like, me stepping on your foot and not acknowledging that I did it and just continuing to move on and say, oh, stop being sensitive, author, because I stepped on your foot. I needed, part of our purpose here was to make sure that we didn't miss the mark, that we understood and acknowledged those missteps, but that we also began to have a coordinated approach in the way that we were going to do this work. So what did we do? We pulled up that equity, diversity, and inclusion framework. We revisited it, we revised it. We did a collaborative, full-scale approach and having people give us feedback, our membership, our boards and committees, our board of directors, our council of representatives. And through that collaborative process, we build consensus. And then we began to reimagine the way that psychology can start to define equity, diversity, and inclusion. I've said in multiple platforms that, when we look at equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the way that we are defining it now, in no way did it match the way that it was originally birthed. It birthed out of the civil rights movement. It really birthed under the umbrella of affirmative action. And for most companies who adopted a framework of EDI, their positioning was around supplier diversity. It wasn't at all in terms of combating the structural and systemic inequities that existed. So we needed to acknowledge things like racism. We needed to make sure that we understood our positionality. We needed to conceptualize what was the role of privilege and white supremacy in this work. And so one of the most important steps that we took in order for us to be able to do this in the right way is to have a uniform definition for racism. Racism at that time became one of the pillars that we decided to take on first in terms of our equity work. And we knew that if we didn't have a uniform definition, and if I sat, and I asked each and every one of you to write in the chat how you define racism, I bet you that all of us would have a different definition. So how do we combat something? How do we dismantle something when we're not in agreement around what we are actually trying to dismantle? So our first call of order was to do that. And we understood that while there are internalized and interpersonal ways in which racism shows itself, and it's the one that we mostly focus on, right? As an association, what you commissioned and part of what we wanted to make sure that we did was to engage in the institutional and structural ways of dismantling racism. And so that's why the uniform definition was so extremely important. And so after we did that, the story didn't end there. The journey became even more complicated. During the presidential year of Dr. Jennifer Kelly, she also, in alignment with the board of directors and her presidential initiatives, understood that without recognition of the harms of psychology, we could never be able to do this work appropriately. And so that we needed to engage in a process of a formal apology to all communities of color for psychology's role in manifesting and contributing to racial hierarchy and other forms of harm. And so what you see here is the Council of Representatives passing a resolution with this apology at the forefront at 100% of our council. Now, I don't know if you know the voting rates of our Council of Representatives, but rarely is there anything that's voted upon at 100%. So we're proud to say that we had the entire backing of the association in this historical moment. And then we needed to really figure out, well, what is it that we are tackling? So we commissioned a historical chronology that came out of the university, the Cummings Center at the University of Akron, Akron University, which holds the psychology archives for all the history of psychology. And I want to just point out a couple of things that we uncovered through this historical process. Now, we're talking about 130-year discipline, right? So we had a lot of information to look through, but mostly are these points that came up. One, that psychology and many psychologists, prominent psychologists, were intimately involved in supporting and perpetuating the idea of eugenics and human hierarchy and the differences in capacity, intellectual capacity, physical capacity, and other capacities because of skin color. We also know that there was widespread use of psychological tests and instruments that discriminated specifically against people of color. We understood that there was a failed effort to take action to end psychometric racism, even though as a discipline, we knew it was happening. And we also created, sustained, and promoted the ideas of human hierarchy through the construction of studies and the interpretation of racial differences. As a psychologist, I remember reading this report, and I don't know if any of you can connect with me at this moment, but this is a discipline that I love. Author and I talked about reasons why we became psychologists, and they're so integrated into who we are. And it was such a sobering moment for me to recognize this history and to recognize that this is the field that at one point I represented. But it also became an opportunity to challenge a system that had historically grounded itself in these atrocities, and an opportunity to create a future in psychology that was based on equity, that was based on a future where we all belonged. And that has been our mission since then. So now what I'll show you is another component that was very necessary in this process. We understand that a lot of the written history has been dictated and authored by many of our white colleagues. And it was important for us that not only did we look at the archives from the perspective of what the written history was, but that instead we also engage in oral ways of capturing history. If you think about communal psychology and if you think about holistic and liberation psychology, it was important for us to have these conversations. And not only because there was a folklore way of sharing tradition and sharing the harms that were done, but also because the sharing of this information became opportunities of healing for those that have carried this ancestrally and are experiencing this today. As many of us say in doing this work, history is today. We're making history as we speak. And so we understood the importance of not only capturing the history around this that people remembered or that were passed on, but also the harms that had been created as we were engaging actively in this work. So, I hope that gives you an idea of not only how APA and more specifically how, as our CEO envisioned, the mental models that we have in terms of transforming psychology and transforming our association were important with the population health framework, but also how that led then to his vision around how we were going to engage in structural and systemic change anchored in equity, diversity, and inclusion. I can't tell you how many times I have heard authors say, EDI is to live in the DNA of the association. It is to be in the fabric of everything that we do. And we knew that we had a starting point, we knew that we had a benchmark to meet, and we knew that we had a path forward. So, author, I have a very important question that I know that the audience will want to know as we're talking about this. What was the call to action? How do we, when people are thinking about engagement in this huge paradigm shift, moving mountains really, not only for APA, but for the field of psychology, what were some specific lessons learned that you can share with us here in terms of understanding how you base experience, past, how we build upon the work that was done of others who were committed to this work, and how we see a path in the future because we learned from the lessons that were there and that may continue to be a barrier to getting this work done.
Yeah, this is great. And I'm going to ask you the same thing in a moment, but let me talk about the work from the standpoint of how we look at how we help people from a mental health or a health standpoint. One of the points I made earlier is that we have to bring all of what we know as psychologists. And one of the things I've always appreciated is that we're trained as scientists and as practitioners. Those of us who are practitioners are trained, most of us trained Boulder model, that we're trained in the science of human behavior, and we are trained as practitioners. That is a very powerful combination. But I think when it comes to working with communities of color and marginalized communities, we often don't embrace the science often for the reasons that you just talked about. We know that science is not pure, that science has been used against communities of color around the world, but specifically in North America and U.S. For example, in earlier in our history in the last century, in the 1900s. It was commonly thought that people from Southern Europe were less intelligent than people from Northern Europe. Well, that wasn't based on data or pure science. That was based on ideas that were floating around in society at the time that infiltrated the science. And we have all kinds of examples like that. But I do believe, as someone who chose to be trained as a scientist and a practitioner, that we don't have to throw the bathwater out with the baby with the bathwater. We do want to throw the bathwater out, but not the baby. And we do want to use science. And I want to give an example. And the reason that I talk so strongly about this when it comes to work around equity, diversity, and inclusion, because I've sat in rooms where people have said correctly that this research was not done with my community in mind, or this research was not done with samples sufficiently large enough for my community for us to have a real understanding. And that is true. But it is also true that sometimes, even when that doesn't happen, there are things that we can learn from the available research. And I want to give one example, because often when we talk about evidence-based practices in the U.S., people will say, well, we just want to ignore all of that. And I believe strongly we can't afford to do that. We have to learn from what the research is and then make modifications. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my work when I was Commissioner of Mental Health in the city of Philadelphia, very large system. And one of the things that we were very intentional about was using the best science to help communities. And in Philadelphia, the population is probably about half of the population are from communities of color. It's a very poor city. About 40% of the people who live in Philadelphia are at or below the poverty line. So huge challenges, lots of cultural diversity. And in that context, we decided that we were going to use the best science to help drive change. Aaron Beck, who many of you know was very influential in cognitive behavioral therapy, lived there, reached out to me early in my tenure. And he said, look, why don't we work together to get this practice, which we know has hundreds of studies that shows its effectiveness, into the hands of people who are in the public sector. Because often the people in the public sector don't get that. And so it started a process of you taking, not just taking what we knew worked from a scientific standpoint, but then modifying it to work from a particular perspective, which we call recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. And this this particular initiative looked at a variety of levels of care, and in particular, the one you're looking at right now is an acute level of care, where people who were just not doing well. They had been in inpatient settings for very long periods of time, very complex issues, and many of these people were in these acute inpatient settings for sometimes a year or longer. And so you can imagine how difficult that was to be in an acute care setting for that long, not getting well. Staff often demoralized. And here's some of the outcomes that we got when we just introduced recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. We reduced the length of stay by half. These programs cost my agency about $600 to $700 a day. So you can see the impact of cutting the length of stay by half. We reduced assaults by 60%. We reduced the use of restraints and seclusion by 2 orders of magnitude. We reduced the need for IM medication, and we were able to get 80% of the people to agree to transitioning to lower levels of care in the community. So huge impact for mostly people of color by bringing in the science. So if you go to the next slide. The other area, if you go to the next slide, is the importance of using the data in our training as scientists, again, in data. If you go to the next slide, this is data called penetration data, which is when we have a population of people in a insurance program, we want to see the proportion of people in that population that actually access behavioral health services. In the private sector, it's about 3 to 5% on average of people in a insurance program in the U.S. will access the mental health benefit. And in the public sector, it's usually about 10 to 15%. And what these data show is that over a 10-year period, you saw our penetration rate, first of all, being pretty high, even for a public health for a public system, but that increasing over time. And so if we were to only look at that, we would conclude that this is a really good thing. But if you go to the next slide, you disaggregate that data, you get a very different picture. You see that for Asian Americans and African Americans, the penetration rate was about roughly half of that of whites and Hispanics. So what that tells us is that we need to use data, disaggregate data to make sure that we understand what's going on in all of those communities that are part of the population. But it doesn't stop there, because what we've been talking about the last few minutes has been that we need to think about how are systems and structures contributing to what we're seeing in the data and the research. What you're seeing here is a map of the city of Philadelphia, and this is what we call geodata. You can map pretty much anything, and what's mapped here, the short version of what's mapped here is utilization data. And basically what these three graphs show you is that the first one shows you utilization patterns, the second one shows you the areas where you had high concentrations of African Americans, and then the third one shows you the distribution of programs in those communities. So part of what this data was telling us was that part of the reason that you saw these disparities in utilization or penetration, people accessing services, had to do with where we actually physically located programs. This is important because we often talk about cultural competency as a way of addressing the inequities that we see. Cultural competency is really important, but if we don't see the structural changes or the structural issues that are driving some of the inequities, and we don't fix those, then all the cultural competency training in the world isn't going to help. So we really have to do both. And I can tell you, for when we had this data was actually done by some of our colleagues at University of Pennsylvania, Eileen Rothbard in particular. When we did this, we then did RFPs, or requests for proposals, for programs in those parts of the city where we had high concentrations of African Americans and low utilization. So it's a both and bringing the science and the data to these structural problems is really important. I know you, Maisa, have, as we've talked about how we go about this work, you've been very methodical and systematic in doing that. We strategize a lot about that, but could you talk a little bit about how you've taken these ideas of changing structures and systems and working in a more systematic way around these things to advance our EDI goals?
Absolutely. So, first we understood, we gathered a lot of information in terms of, if we're going to issue an authentic apology, what are the elements that are necessary in order for that apology to be something that is meaningful and impactful. So we needed to understand what that looked like. And one of our divisions, Division 45, which looks at the work of ethnicity and race, issued a report called The Warrior's Path. And that report is on our website. If anybody wants to look at any of these documents, they exist in the EDI page on the APA website. And there are three specific elements that were necessary. One is that we needed to acknowledge what we did. Two is that we needed to, and be clear about it, and that came through the chronology. Two is that we needed to have an authentic and real apology, and we did that formally and publicly through the council meeting and in other mechanisms. But three, and probably the most important, is that we needed to have a clear path for repair and reconciliation that turned into action, right? So people were pretty tired of the idea of lip service. I mean, this is work that we've been trying to get off the ground for a really long time, but didn't quite know the mechanisms and the methodologies that were needed in order for us to effectuate change and for us to see real impact. So when we passed the resolution for the apology, there were two other resolutions that were passed. So it was a trio of resolutions, one that was focused on health equity, which we knew was really important, especially in this day and age as we're dealing with post-COVID, types of issues worldwide. But we also knew that as a discipline, psychology had a unique role to play in understanding how we will dismantle systemic racism in specific sectors and settings across, across our society. And so these trio of resolutions, through multiple think tanks, experts, subject matter experts throughout the globe, came together to establish not only what were the whereas statements, which is what happened, what was done, but the therefore statements, which would be our action steps. What will we do in order to engage in the process of repair and reconciliation? And that yielded across the three resolutions, 54 calls to action. And distilled from those 54 calls to action came an opportunity for us to audit what is it that we are really doing as a discipline, right? I think that one of the things that we tend to jump into when we're doing this work related to EDI is that we have a lot of passion and we have a lot of commitment. But sometimes it can be quite performative if we don't understand exactly what it is that we're trying to tackle, which is why we went through the methodology of first defining what it is that we're doing and making sure that we had a uniform definition, then making sure that we created the frameworks and the models, that mental models that were necessary to do this work and sustain this work over time, then engage in the apology, and finally do an audit of our work. Well, Arthur, what ended up happening, and you know this because we had countless conversations, but I'd love to share it with the audience, is that when we did an audit last year and we looked at, okay, what is it that we're doing across the association? We're a Big 10 organization, multiple, aspects, pillars, verticals to our work. Who was doing what related to dismantling racism work and advancing racial equity, which is really the goal. And so we had 269 distinct pieces of information that came in through an inclusion criteria, because there were lots of things that were excluded that really didn't meet the criteria for either dismantling racism or advancing racial equity work. And out of those 269 pieces of information, what we found is that largely our work was severely uncoordinated. And because of the lack of uncoordination, we couldn't measure sustainable impact. And at the end of the day, impact is part of everything that we do. I mean, it leads our strategic plan. It is something that you as a CEO has positioned to be the way that we are focused in terms of the future of psychology and APA. And at the point that we couldn't demonstrate impact, we knew we had to take a step back. We had now the data that informed the way that we were going to move forward. We knew what our baseline was. And from that baseline, we can carry on to start to think about where is our action plan going to actually activate. And here's what we came up with, these priorities that you see here. After much work in terms of multiple think tanks that we brought together, lots of conversations with virtual communities in terms of having this discussion, we have decided that our racial equity action plan is going to focus in these four pieces. One is health and continuing to advance health equity. The next would be knowledge production and understanding how our scientific and research enterprise will represent scientists of color to contribute to this work and increase the equitable nature in the way that we engage in psychological science, in the way that we do our research, in our publication, in everything that is related to our science. We knew we needed to work on our APA, APA as an organization, but also the workforce. The workforce has changed significantly. We can never go back to what was before COVID. The only thing that we can do is understand the lessons that were learned through this moment in time that really, was an incredible traumatic experience for many worldwide. And now, how do we engage people not only in understanding how we work, but how do we understand how EDI needs to be incorporated in everything that we do? And then lastly, how we create educational equity. At first, it was really focused in the training of psychologists, increasing representation. We know that at least on the side of the United States, the demographics in terms of psychology is that our discipline is 86% white. When we looked at the statistics in Canada, it's pretty similar. And so when we start to bring the idea of representation, what does that look like? And we knew that it began in the education process and in the educational pathway, but we also knew that it couldn't start at graduate school. It certainly couldn't start once, there was transformation of going from trainee to psychologist. We really needed to start this in middle school and, dare I say, in elementary or even, kindergarten, socializing children to have a passion for psychology and helping them understand what it really means. What does it mean to become a psychologist? And building equity in the gaps that existed right now in terms of our educational system. So these are the four main priorities that we will be focused on. These will both cover our short-term goals, which there are some that we are going to be able to demonstrate achievement and impact in this year in 23. And we're going to focus on coordinating those strategies so that we can demonstrate impact, but some that are going to require 5-10 years of change. And I think as long as we stay the path, we stay the course, and we don't deviate, although I think that sometimes people do want to see programs and other initiatives that happen right away. Structural change doesn't happen within the context of that capacity. The other thing that I want to be able to demonstrate is that, in order for this change to happen, the governing body of the association, the board of directors, the executive leadership team, our CEO needed to be behind this. And what many people said when we had the listening sessions and when they were talking to us is that you need to put your money where your mouth is, right? And we understood that without a monetary commitment and contribution to doing this work, it would be very difficult to engage in that third piece of the apology, which is the process of repair and reconciliation. So during the August meeting of the association, the Council of Representatives voted on seeding $1.1 million in terms of working in racial equity work. Wow. If there's any moment that was historic and continuing to move this work forward was when those votes came in, and we are in the process of seeding that. What I love about the how we have structured this is that this fund will live in perpetuity. Outside of our time here, Arthur, you and I, this will outlive us, not just in our generation, but in our children's generation and their children's generation. And that was really our focus. How do we build sustainability beyond us? So this is the way that the work is done. It's specific, it's thoughtful, it's methodical. You can't give up. There has to be a lot of grit and determination, but there also has to be a lot of support and backing. So, as we turn over and we're sort of wrapping up our time, I know that many here can start to think about, okay, systemic change is really important. We know that that's what's going to effectuate long-term change. But what happens to the community in between, right? How does this trickle down to them? How does this cascade down? Are they being affected or impacted, or is there any change happening at the grassroots level? So I think that we're at a perfect time to ask the question, the entire spirit of this conversation, which is, are we there yet, Arthur? Are we there yet? How do we impact communities? How do we assure that the voices of those that are most affected are centered in this conversation? And I'd love for you to talk to us about that.
Yeah. I think that this is at the heart of the work. And I think this brings us right back to where we started, which is I became a psychologist because I wanted to have impact on people's lives. And I think most psychologists, that is true. As we did our strategic plan, there's a very strong theme. So I don't think I'm unique in that. But one of the things that I have learned from that perspective is how important it is to listen to the people that we want to help. I have this saying, inherent in every community is the wisdom to solve its own problems. That people know what they need, they know what the problems are, they know what will help them. What they often need are the resources and sometimes the expertise that we might bring to partner with them, not to tell them what to do. And so I want to give some examples of that and use some examples from my work prior to coming to APA. What we've been doing today, it really is talking about two things that came through loud and clear in our strategic plan that psychologists within APA and frankly outside of APA, we want to have impact on our field, and Misa's talked about that, and we want to have impact on the world. And I've been talking about that piece of it. And so I want to talk a little bit about and give 4 quick examples of what I think when I say inherent in every community is wisdom to solve its own problems, some examples of how we might go about that. So one of the challenges we have in serving communities of color is that for some subsets of those communities, the challenges are even greater. And in the US, it is for men of color. And one of the things we did in the city of Philadelphia is an initiative to see if we could reach men of color and normalize mental health issues. Because we know in our country, if you're African-American male, juvenile, you're more likely, and you have a mental health challenge, you're more likely to be in the juvenile justice system than other folks, rather as opposed to being in the treatment system. If you are an African-American male, you're more likely to be incarcerated. You're more likely to get help, if you ever get help, in an emergency department. So we were really looking at how do we change that and start to normalize mental health so that people can reach out for help earlier. And the way we decided to do it is through storytelling. The person you see here is a famous Philadelphian. If you watch American TV and the Jimmy Fallon show, he's the band leader of The Roots. And he's from Philadelphia. And so the first thing we did was kind of put out a call for men who might be willing to tell their stories, not believing that men would want to talk publicly about their own mental health. Well, one of the things that we did is that we reframed the issue. We changed the language. We didn't talk about mental health or mental illness. We talked about mental strength and mental wellness. And we wanted to get men to talk about that, which turns out that men did want to have that, including these very famous individuals. And so we had these events where, the first time we did it, we had a venue of about 300 people and then 600 people. And then you're seeing a venue of 1,000 people that were coming out to hear these men tell their stories about how they had navigated life, how they had navigated the challenges that they had, and how they were focused on their own mental health and their own mental wellness and own mental strength. Very powerful, both for the audiences, who were often people who were just community people, but also people who were serving these communities, but very powerful for men of color, not just African American, because we did this with African American men, Latino men, Asian men, that for all of those groups, that this was a very powerful way of reframing the conversations so that the conversation and the issue was accessible. You go to the next slide. Another strategy is listening to people in the community. These are members of the Burmese and Bhutanese communities. The lesson that we learned in working with immigrant communities is that we have to listen. And so these communities often had many challenges, trauma. They're coming from countries that where there's turmoil. They're not going to walk into a traditional mental health program and ask for help or trauma treatment. And so when we ask the communities, well, what do you think? How do you think we can best reach your communities? Their solution was to create sites and programs that people would naturally come to, like a immigration program, or a program that would help new immigrants to the country, where people could get help on things like English as a second language, navigating our immigration system, and then embed mental health professionals who are culturally competent in those settings. So if you contrast that approach to the black box approach, which would have been going into community, setting up a program, and then asking people to come to the program, rather we flipped that on the head, went to where people were naturally going to the people where they trusted and embedded within those settings the mental health expertise. So that solution came from the community. And anytime we listen to the community, we're almost always going to get better solutions. If you go to the next slide. Working at a higher level of analysis. The issue of trauma in major urban areas is huge. And the clinical approach to dealing with trauma, and this is the way I came at trauma early in my career as well, is trauma is something in an individual, right? That it happens to a person and that we need to work with that individual who's been traumatized. Well, in large cities and in most communities, we have hundreds, thousands, and sometimes tens of thousands of people who have experienced trauma. And if you look at the ACEs study, we know that many people have experienced all kinds of adverse events that affect their trajectory in life. And so at some point, we started to reframe and to rethink this, again, moving away from this black box, treat one person at a time, to thinking about, and not to say that that's not important, that is absolutely important. That's why I always talk about the top part of the pyramid. But if that's the only thing that we're doing, we're missing lots of people. And so if we can take a more public health approach like this in the aftermath of a event, going into training people from the community, not just mental health professionals, but individuals who are their peers, on how to support people who've been traumatized in the aftermath of traumatic events. We're not waiting for people to develop PTSD or other kinds of mental health challenges. We're going into communities saying, here's what a normal trauma, here's what a normal reaction is, and here's what is a reaction that might indicate that you're having problems, and here is information for how you can get additional support. So not waiting till people are in crisis, as often happens with communities of color. But then there are other public health strategies. One of the things we do in public health is we do routine screenings. We screen for cancers, we screen for diabetes, we screen for all kinds of things, but we don't routinely do that for mental health. And so we wanted to take that idea and use that and apply that to trauma for children. In this case, we took some of those evidence-based practices evidence-based treatment approaches that I talked about earlier. This is, again, a map of Philadelphia. The dots there are programs all over the city. And then we started screening children through a federal grant in settings where kids were already going, their primary care physician or other providers. Turns out that a third of the children in Philadelphia that we were screening were exposed to trauma and could benefit from treatment. And so we were able to then refer those children directly into evidence-based treatment approaches. So again, working at a different level of analysis, thinking about how we take lessons from public health and how do we work not just at the top part of the pyramid, but in that risk part as well. And then last example I want to give is this one around how do we empower communities. What you are looking at right here is a mural. And if you go to the city of Philadelphia, you'll see hundreds of murals all over the city. The city has had a mural arts program for many years, and the director of that program, just phenomenal person. But to give you a sense of the magnitude, this picture was taken a mile away from this mural. So it gives you a sense of the size of some of these projects. If you go to the next slide. It turns out when I listened to the director of the program, a woman named Jane Golden, that the murals are actually done by the community. And we thought, and if you're in Philadelphia, you would know this, that there is a very long waiting list, sometimes years, because people really want to have these community art projects, because the community comes together and comes up with the idea, they work with an artist, and what you see here are people actually painting that concept, and that gets adhered to the wall, those walls that you saw there. What if the topics were not, maybe some of the other topics that people were doing, but topics on issues related to mental health? Could this be a way of addressing these issues in communities? So this first one, if you click, was on the issue of resilience in children. If you go to the next one, this one is in an immigrant community where people were talking about some of the psychological challenges of immigration. Again, communities come together and come up with these. The next is one on suicide. Over 1,000 people worked on this particular mural, where if you can see over to the left part of the mural, those portraits, those are people who died by suicide. And so family members and colleagues, we have a number of firefighters who died the year that we were doing this. And so firefighters came and they honored their colleagues who had died by suicide and family members. And so it was both an opportunity to do healing for people who had been affected by suicide survivors and their families, but it was also a way of engaging the community in a conversation that, had we gone into the community and said, hi, we're from the mental health department, we want to talk about suicide, we may have gotten 5 people and 3 of them would have been related to me. But in these community art projects, we actually get dozens and sometimes hundreds of people to come. And then this one was one where we, again, 1,000 people worked on this particular mural. And it actually, because it was, there was a treatment program in this building, and it was done with many of the people in the community, surrounding community, it actually changed the dynamic. There was a lot of stigma about this program in the community, but because the people in the program, including the clients in the program, were working with members of the community, it actually changed the dynamic between that program and the community. So the whole idea is, as practitioners, as people who are trying to help communities, how do we do that? How do we go in and listen to communities? How do we work at a different level of analysis? How do we use existing structures in communities to engage people in a respectful way, in a way that hears people, but in a way that can be very powerful and impactful? So just some ideas, and what Maisa and I have been able to share with you is our thinking, both around how we're trying to change our field, and then how are we trying to change how we work in communities to reach more people and have the kind of impact that we want to have around issues of equity and social justice.
2:15, and I don't want to, exploit your generosity any further.
Thank you.
You'd like to come back another time, right?
Yes. So on that note, would like to provide our closing remarks. Erin was going to do that, but she had to go. So on behalf of all of us here today, we genuinely and are very grateful for you, Dr. Akbar, and for you, Dr. Evans. It's really been so wonderful and a joy having you here. We appreciate your time. Dr. Maisa, I've never heard you speak, and so I am so honored. I learned a great deal of information from your presentation, things I never knew about, even the history around psychology and the harm it's created for those people who look like me. I'm impressed, and I take this information with me to share with my colleagues, and I'm sure all of you here with us are going to do likewise. And Dr. Evans, what an honor to have you again here with us. It's the first time here, but for me, I've had the dealings with you and chat with you. So I'm grateful that you took this opportunity and decided to join us here in Canada virtually. We hope we can have you here in person at some point, and offer you a really great hospitality. On behalf of everyone, we say thank you so much, and we look forward to connecting with you in the near future. God bless you. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Happy Black History. Keep on that Black History power. Keep going. We're doing great work one day at a time. And we're sure Canada is going to move towards some positive change. And thank you, Dr. Cohen. I know you've left us, or you're here, not sure. We want to thank you so much for joining us. And we want to say thank you to Dr. Giddens, who is our new president-elect, our first ever Black president-elect of the CPA. So if CPA is making progress, I think they are. So thank you. And we hope all of you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Honored to be here.